So we're going to move into the next session, the last session of the day, and it's called Leveling the Playing Field, Carbon Border Adjustments and Carbon Markets. And you know me by now. I'll be moderating this session as well, but I promise it's the last one. We do have two, let's call it scene-setting presentations kicking off this discussion today. And the first one is from Vicente Hurtado Roa. He's the head of units at the European Commission in the DG Taxud, and he's responsible for the carbon border adjustment mechanism as well as the energy taxation, two of the flagship initiatives of the European Green Deal. So he's here to tell us about CBAM and how the implementation is going. So, Vicente, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Osa. Thank you, worldsteel, for this invitation. If I recall well, I was here in 2021, so 3 years ago. Well, not in this hotel, in another hotel. I'm wrong.
Well, you've been speaking to our Environment Committee, and that was fantastic, but not at the open forum.
Oh, okay, good. I've been upgraded.
So this is the first, yes?
I've been upgraded. Okay, good. Good to know. Anyway, I was in a different scenario, but 3 years ago, at the moment of the adoption by the Commission of the CBAM. And since then, of course, many things have happened. In the middle, of course, there was the adoption. And then also, as the brochure or the program says, the CBAM has already started to apply. The transitional phase is now in progress. And this is what I want to explain to you a bit today. My objective, of course, is to make you more familiar with the CBAM. I don't know exactly what is the average knowledge of the CBAM in the audience, so I will start a bit from the basics, but I don't have much time to elaborate a lot. But I think what is important, of course, is that we all understand the objectives, because when you know the objectives with a measure, it makes it for you more palatable, at least, or acceptable. And it's also part of our communication campaign, of course, to get you closer to the CBAM. But I also want to go a bit forward. I want to take little stock for the moment of how the transitional period is moving, and I will explain why. And then, of course, I want to tell you a bit about what we are intending to do from now until the end of the transitional period, which will be at the end of 2025. As you can see, we have made an important campaign also translating the guidance, for example, for exporters into different languages. I can tell you that now the guidance is already in Hindi, Korean, Turkish, Arabic, of course, English, French, German, another language, and I think Japanese is coming, and others that I forgot, of course, are coming as well. Well, in a nutshell, what we are trying to do, of course, is to try to make sure that exporters, because you are the front runners, you are the very first concerned with the implementation of the CBAM, but in particular also the importers in the EU are aware of how the CBAM will work. So coming really to the basics, and very quickly, the objectives with the CBAM is to mirror and to complement the carbon price system in the EU, which is the EU ETS, the emission trading scheme, which has been placed for around 15 years, and which has been, if you ask me, which has been effective at reducing emissions in the European Union. Also, you know that the European Union has committed to become net zero or neutral, carbon neutral by 2050, which is a high ambitious level. I can imagine that some people maybe in the audience is already panicking with this type of objectives. And even before that, of course, by 2030, our objective is to reduce emissions by 55%, which is a lot as well. And also in the middle, now we have communicated or announced in a recent communication, that the European Commission would like to achieve a 90% reduction of emissions by 2040. Of course, if we want to be on track for 2050, the work and the homework has to start now. Well, it has already started, to be honest, and in particular in a sector like the steel, which is introducing new technologies in order to decarbonize. And this is what we try to do with the CBAM. So the CBAM should be an incentive for decarbonization in the EU, and I will explain later on, but also in third countries. At the same time, we want to be fair. We want to make sure that all goods sold in the EU territory apply the same rules. It doesn't matter whether it was produced in a steel maker installation in the EU or in an installation in China or in Japan. What we want to make sure is that those goods abide by the same rules and apply the same carbon price. This is the reason why the CBAM will work very, very similarly to the ETS, how it works. The carbon price will be the same, so there is a price which is set by an auction every week in the EU ETS, and this will be also the reference for the CBAM certificates. The importers in the EU will have to buy also those CBAM certificates from 2026 according to the embedded emissions, also mirroring how the installations in the EU ETS are working, functioning at this moment, and there will be an obligation for reporting at the end of the period. On top of that, of course, if there is a carbon price which has already been paid at the source, an explicit compliance carbon price, that carbon price will also be able to be deducted from the adjustment. We don't want to have a double carbon price. We know that many countries have a carbon price or are enhancing their carbon price. I will give you the example of Turkey, which is introducing an ETS from next year, not surprisingly on the CBAM sectors. But that's a good development. We don't impose, of course, any obligations on third countries how they have to decarbonize, how fast they have to decarbonize, what technologies they have to use, but of course, and if they have to introduce a carbon price or not, and whether an ETS or a carbon tax. But what we can see is that by introducing the CBAM, we are giving a signal to the producers also in third countries, to the governments in third countries to decarbonize and to introduce carbon pricing, which in the end is good news because the main objective with this environmental measure, of course, is to ensure decarbonization around the world. So that's a bit the basics. I forgot to say what I think that it's evident for us, but maybe it's important to underline. What we do, the design of the measure, of course, is in compliance with all our obligations, international obligations. It goes by saying that, of course, with the WTO, but also with the Paris Agreement, but including also with the free trade agreements, with the customs unions with Turkey, and other type of agreements that we have with countries. The sectors in the scope, as you know, one of the sectors is iron and steel, the other sectors are aluminum, cement, fertilizers, but also hydrogen and electricity. These are the sectors which are most intensive in carbon emissions. With them, we cover around 55% of the emissions in the EU ETS, and they are also the sectors which are subject to a lot of trade with third countries. With the measure, we don't want to stop importations. This is not a competitiveness measure. We are not protecting the EU industry with this measure. As I said before, we are applying the same rules, and I will explain later on a bit more. And at the same time, this measure is not a trade measure. We don't want to introduce trade barriers. I know that sometimes we are criticized, but also the design of the measure has been done in a way that goods will be able to flow through the borders to the EU with no controls, more than the usual controls by the borders, so no obligation at the moment of the importation. This is not a tax at the moment of the importation, this is not a customs duty or a tariff, so goods will flow as now, but the importers will have an obligation by the end of the year to surrender a number of certificates, of CBAM certificates, which correspond to the emissions embedded in the imported goods. Discussions are still going on the possibility of extending the scope. There are two ways of extending the scope. One is to other basic goods. Think about chemicals, think about fuels. These are examples. Glass, ceramics, okay? So in principle, the sectors which are more at risk of carbon leakage, and that's something that the Commission will be analyzing from now until the end of the transitional period in December 2025. And the other option, of course, is the downstream goods. If we are producing goods which are intensive in steel, is there an incentive to produce these goods overseas and not in the EU because of the CBAM? We analyzed that in 2021 when the Commission came with the initial proposal. We came to the conclusion that because of the slow phase-in introduction of the CBAM, that was not really an issue, but that's something that we will looking at again. I can tell you that, for example, part of the industry is very much interested in that because they consider that by introducing CBAM, and therefore there will be a cost, for example, on the steel imported for the production of washing machines, this may have an impact also on the trade with these products. So that's something that we will be analyzing from now until the end of the transitional period, and we will be taking decisions. As I will explain later on a bit more in detail with the transitional period, we have already collected data for the first reporting quarter from October 2023 to December 2023. And we already know, I mean, this information also comes from the customs data, from the trade data, but we already have an indication or an understanding of the volumes that are imported into the EU with CBAM goods according to countries of origin, but also according to the different sectors. Don't take the figures, because I can see that you are taking pictures. In any case, I think that the presentation will be circulated, but don't take those figures are perfect figures, because they are only data. It's only data that we extracted in February from the first reports. The reports have continued arriving, so that data is completely old-fashioned. But I think that what is important to see, of course, is that, as expected, steel, iron and steel is one of the products in the CBAM scope which is more traded into the EU, of course, followed by fertilizers and cement, and then there is a little less, much less of aluminium. Hydrogen and electricity, well, nothing in terms of hydrogen for the moment. In terms of electricity, very few flows, maybe from some neighboring countries, Western Balkans, Turkey, Morocco. I know that there are a lot of plans for exporting electricity to the EU, and this is also the reason why we introduce electricity and CBAM into the scope, because, as you know, part of the strategy of the European Union is to expand, of course, the use of those products, and in particular, green electricity and green hydrogen. So we saw also the CBAM as an opportunity to give a signal and to give a message to reduce their carbon intensity. So, as I mentioned before, we started with a transitional period, which will end at the end of 2025, and then from 2026 we'll be gradually introducing the CBAM. The transitional period is the moment where we want to learn. The Commission wants to learn from third countries. We want to learn about methodologies around the world. We want to learn about different systems of carbon pricing. And we also want to learn about the application of the system and the impacts of the system. For example, we will be doing an analysis of the impacts on developing and LDCs, which I think is very, very relevant. We receive a lot of questions about the impact on those countries, although they are not the most impacted, as you could see on the graph before. But of course, I understand their concern, and in particular how we can help you. And we can help them. As you know, there will be a new COP29 in Baku, and the main subject or topic for discussions will be the financing of the climate transition. And the European Commission, of course, is very much concerned with that, and we are very much participating in the preparation of this COP29. But the transitional period will also be the moment for everyone to learn, for importers to understand how they have to report, and we have set up a specific registry where the quarterly reports have to be submitted, so they will understand how the system works, what they need to do, and they will be ready from 2026 to really apply the full system. But also for the exporters in third countries, overseas, because they are the ones who know their products. They are the ones who know the carbon intensity, so they have to monitor the emissions, they have to report the emissions, and also from 2026 there will be an obligation for verifying the emissions. During this transitional period, we all learned, we take lessons, and on the basis of that, we will come to Council and Parliament. As you know, we had votes in the European Parliament last weekend. We will come to the new Parliament and to the Council with proposals, with ideas in a number of reports where we will be analyzing the impact during the transitional period and also how we see improvements for the future. But I will come back to that later on. So I said before that also from 2026, there will be a gradual introduction of the CBAM. Why? Because, as possibly you know, in the EU ETS, most of the sectors already have free allowances. So allowances which are given free, and in particular, in the case of the steel, I think if my numbers are correct, around 80% of the carbon emissions are covered currently by free allowances. Those free allowances have to be phased out for all sectors in the ETS. It's not something specific to the CBAM. The question is the trajectory. As you know, there is a clear trajectory until 2030. Now the European Commission is working on the targets for 2040. I understand that by the end of 2025, my colleagues in DG Clima and the European Commission will be announcing also the trajectories for the free allowances for the rest, for all the sectors until 2040. Possibly before 2040, the free allowances will have to be phased out. But in the case of the CBAM, there will be a phase out, which is already clear, and which will be from 26 to 2034. As you can see on the graph, the reduction of the free allowances is very gradual at the beginning. I would say very low at the beginning. But then, of course, there is a peak of acceleration, which is by 2030, and then from 2030 to 2034. I cannot elaborate more on how the free allowances are set. I will just say that they correspond to a benchmark which is set in the EU ETS and is set at the level of the average of the 10% of the best producers in every sector. And the benchmarks which will be there for the EU producers will be also recognized for the imported goods. That's important to know. This is why we say that CBAM will also be gradually introduced from 26 to 2034. Very quickly on the transitional period, as I mentioned before, the objective is to collect data. This is why it's very important that we get good data. The Commission has published a list of default values, so some sort of world average of carbon intensities per goods. The publication was done last December, and they can be used until July of this year, so for the third reporting period of the CBAM in the transitional period, but we really need to collect good data. If we don't get the data, and I will come back to the challenge with the data, we cannot do a good analysis. So this is why, and this is my main message to you today, we need to contribute to get the data. I know that there are challenges to get the data, but we all need to make an effort to get the data because that would be in the advantage of everyone. In the advantage of the importers to understand the goods that they are importing and to understand how many CBAM certificates they will need to buy from 2026. And they will also have the possibility to choose between some producers in third countries or some other producers in third countries according to the carbon intensity. And this is good because the measure, again, has as a main objective to decarbonize. And with the measure, we can, of course, give rewards to those producers in third countries which are really decarbonizing. But we need to get that data. And the data only comes from one source, of course. As I said before, the producer in the third country, you know your goods, or the producers in third countries know their goods, so they have to be able to monitor and report. Verification will come later on. So again, the obligations are on the importers, but of course the data has to come from the exporters. I have to say that an important difference between the transitional period and the definitive regime is that in the transitional period from October, we want to collect real data. So in principle, default values cannot be used because otherwise we don't get information, we don't get data, and then we will miss this opportunity. But it's true that from 2026, in principle, the system is based again on the real data. But of course, if there is a problem to get the real data, there will always be the possibility of using the default values. The default values will not be the same. I mentioned before that we published in last December default values, which are the average of the world carbon intensity per goods. But in December next year, we will publish another list. I hope it will be in December or November. Okay. By the end of next year, we will publish a new list. We are working with a joint research center, JRC, in the Commission to come with a new list. It will be a list good by good, but country by country. So it's a big effort. So this is also why data is important for us. And there will be some sort of markup. We are still figuring how the markup will work, how the markup will be, but the idea is that default values are a disincentive to be, or there is a disincentive to use the default values, and that in the end, all importers and exporters will be providing real data. If you use the default values, you cannot show how good you are. So in principle, and I understand that those who will have a carbon intensity below the default values will also have an interest in providing that data. So until July, you can still use default values. And I can tell you that in the two first reporting periods, still 95% of the reports still were based on default values. From October, they should move to actual emissions. And we have also provided for a transitional methodology, how to assess those emissions. And this is the guidance I mentioned before, which is already available in many different languages, which will help you to monitor and to provide those emissions. If you have another methodology in your country which is equivalent to our methodology, you can still use that methodology until December. That means until the reporting obligations or the reporting period in January 2025. That's also an advantage that gives you more time to understand our methodology and also to adapt. So more importantly now, what comes next? We are listening to you. We are listening to everyone. We understand that there are a lot of challenges. So now what we want to do from now until the end of the transitional period is to come with, first of all, to understand how we can ensure the compliance with the CBAM for both importers and exporters. And there are many challenges, I understand. One of the challenges I mentioned before, of course, is getting the data. This is what we hear from the importers very often. I don't get the data. I can tell you, for example, that in the case of very small importations or very small importers, there is a big challenge because it's difficult to get the data, and in particular if the exporter is a small producer, and we know that. However, I think that it's important to make an effort. I said before, it's important in view of the definitive regime to understand. It's important, but not only for the CBAM, because I think in the future, everyone will have to know its products, will need to know also the carbon intensity of the goods. And let's take the CBAM as an opportunity or as an excuse to start understanding how to monitor emissions and how to know your emissions. But of course, we understand the challenge. We understand that for some exporters, from some importers, it's a big challenge, not only because of the size, but also because of the country. In many countries, they don't have any monitoring system at all. So they are still starting. I mean, I was discussing yesterday, I was in a webinar yesterday with Trinidad and Tobago, which is a big exporter of fertilizers to the EU. And they have a challenge because they don't have carbon price, they don't have monitoring in place, but they are already working on that. They are already considering the introduction, and there is a really good will in order to do that. We know that there is a need for time, so let's relax. The transitional period is a period to learn. It's not a period to apply penalties. It's a period, of course, to comply, and that's what we expect. But penalties, in principle, will be there, of course, for those who don't comply with the system, but not for those who do a good will or who show a goodwill in order to comply with the system. Another challenge that we hear very often from producers in third countries is trade confidentiality. I don't want to share some of the parameters with my importers, and we understand. Not all of them, I have to say, but for example, we can understand that maybe the share of scrap in the production of steel can be something sensitive and that you don't want to share, for example, with the importers. For the moment, the box in the registry to submit that information is not compulsory, it's voluntary. If you know the data, even better. We need this data because that helps us to understand and also to calculate and to make an assessment whether the calculation of the emissions was correct and to provide some feedback to the importers and to the exporters, but we also understand the confidentiality with that data. We are now working swiftly to come with a new module in the registry, in the CBAM registry, by the beginning of next year, where also the installations of third countries will be able to register and they will be able to submit that information directly to us. We understood that that was not a problem, that the problem is more sharing with importers, but that's something, of course, that we would like also to hear from you. In the definitive regime, maybe that will be less relevant. I'm not saying that we will drop this obligation because it's the only way to really make a good assessment of the emissions. But it's true that in the definitive regime, there will be an obligation of verification by an independent third party. And we are working on that, as I will show you later on. And therefore, maybe some of the elements are less important if there is a good verification. But again, if we want to challenge the verification, we would need that data. We want to reduce the administrative burden. I mentioned before the challenge for small importations. I know that many of you, but also the national competent authorities for CBAM are very much interested in simplifying, in particular for those small importations. That's something that we are analyzing. I can tell you that from the data that we have collected, around 90% of the importations correspond to less than 10% of the CO2 embedded emissions or quantities. So that gives you already an idea that the bulk of the CO2 emissions and the quantities imported into the EU are really concentrated on a number of small producers or large producers, but a small quantity of producers, and therefore there is a need for doing something. That's something that we are looking at. I'm not sure we can come with something for the transitional period for legal reasons, but of course that's something that we are considering for the definitive period. Of course, complementarity with and alignment with international measures. As you know, OECD in the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches is analyzing different systems to decarbonize. They are comparing ETS systems with carbon taxes and also with other, for example, like standards. And they are also working on the methodology for assessing emissions, and that's important for us. The European Commission is contributing to this work, but also with money. So we are financing also one pilot project in Nigeria on decarbonization and the impact of decarbonization. And we are also very much interested, of course, in this work on the methodology, because we understand that having one methodology would be ideal. Sometimes what is ideal is not easy, but of course we are struggling to get there. There is also the Climate Club led by Germany. There will be measures or ideas presented in Baku in November at the COP 29. And we know that there are also other initiatives for other CBAMs around the world. UK maybe is the most advanced. They have already launched a consultation on the design, and they are considering introducing the measure in 2027. But also Australia has launched a consultation. There were ideas in Canada. The US have other ideas. We have to see what happens, of course, in the elections. But now they have set up in the US a task force on climate-friendly trade, which will look at carbon intensities of imported goods into the US. So we will need, I mean, now it's premature. Don't ask me what we are going to do, because first we need to see what is coming. But then, of course, just to let you know that for us, what is ideal, of course, is to find solutions around the world that everyone commits to decarbonization. And in that case, we will not need a CBAM. We will not need many of the measures. As I always say, the best CBAM in the future will be the CBAM that doesn't apply. So let's see, maybe. That will be less work for me. I will do something else. And then finally, one important dimension that we need to analyze, and that's, of course, sensitive for the producers in the EU, is the external part, of course, of all this. As I said before, the free allowances will be gone, and I would like to insist, in any case, they will have to go, because if we want to reach our targets by 2030, 2040, 2050, we need to get rid of the free allowances, and that will be for all sectors. But of course, if we have to get rid of the free allowances by 2034, that also may have an impact on the exports. Because now, as you know, the measure to deal with the carbon leakage in the EU is the free allowances. And it's an advantage that also helps with exports, because it reduces the carbon price, regardless of whether you sell in the EU or you sell outside the EU. If we remove the free allowances and we only introduce a measure which is on the importation of the goods into the EU, it's clear that this external dimension will disappear. We will analyze that. We came to the conclusion in 2021 that because of this low introduction or reduction of the free allowances, at least by 2030, the impact will be not meaningful. But of course, that's something that we want to analyze. I cannot tell you now what are the options, but I can just say that, of course, we are looking at this. But of course, whatever we can propose has to be compliant with our WTO commitments and with the rest, of course, of our engagements. Finally, very quickly, we are working, of course, on how to do the accreditation and the verification. I mentioned before that only from 26 there will be an obligation for verification. In principle, the accrediting bodies will be the ones which are now in place in the 27 member states. So these are the accreditation bodies that will have to apply. Then, of course, the verifiers, and we are still discussing. I know that there is a lot of interest in some countries to be able to appoint also their own verifiers. For example, I mentioned before Turkey, who is introducing an ETS. They will also have their accrediting body. They will have also their verifiers. They would also like to use that setup or infrastructure also for the CBAM. But of course, we need to find a balance between something which is practical, but at the same time ensures reliability. So that's something that we are still analyzing how it could work. Of course, we will come with a new list of default values. I mentioned that before. We will have to publish also the rules for the free allocation adjustment. You remember the curve with the free allowances phase out. So we have to set up also the benchmark year per year, good per good, also for the imported goods. And I have to say that it's not so easy. It's not just copy and paste from the ETS, because we are talking here about goods, not about installations. And we will also work, of course, on the modalities, how to take into account the carbon price. We have a definition of the carbon price, ETS, carbon tax. I know, and this is also the subject of the debate today, or the panel today, the development of carbon markets. I think that we can discuss a bit more about that during the panel. And finally, this is the end. Yeah? No, there is another one, I'm sure. No, wait. Very quickly. We are working, as I said before, on potential extension of the scope in terms of sectors, but also in terms of emissions. And I just wanted to finish by saying that for the moment, we only include scope 1, which is direct emissions at the site or at the installation, including cooling and heating. We don't include electricity or the emissions from the electricity for the production of the goods, for example, in the case of the steel or aluminum. They are only included in the case of cement and fertilizers. Different thing is that during this transitional period, we also want to get that data because we are analyzing, of course, the possibility of extending. And I will not elaborate more, although it's a very interesting issue, is the calculation of emissions for the imported electricity, because I understand that it's less relevant for you. But of course, we are also analyzing how to set up the default values in a way which at the same time ensures that we capture the emissions, but at the same time we give an incentive to third countries to decarbonize. We know about the plans, for example, in the north of Africa, in the Maghreb, for producing more and more green hydrogen, green ammonia, and also green electricity, and their interest, of course, to export to the EU. And the European Commission is very, very much welcoming, of course, all those initiatives. And with that, I will stop here, and of course, I will be happy taking questions. And I'm sure I exceeded my time.
All right, thank you very much. I'm sure you have plenty of questions, but please, let's just keep them for the panel. Yeah, have a seat. And then let me introduce our next speaker. Sorry, I should just, yes, there we are. Antoine Wagner-Jones is head of trade and supply chains team at Bloomberg NEF. His team is analyzing the impact of industrial strategy, manufacturing economics, and carbon border tariffs. So I'll hand over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm lucky in going after a presentation where so much detail has been sort of outlaid in a very expert manner, so I get to talk about the fun bits. But first of all, very quickly, before I go into just a few points that I think are interesting around the CBAM and some things that we should probably consider in this important period where there's there's still to define. A very quick word about BNEF. I'm very lucky. I work with about 300 of my colleagues. They have offices all over the world. That informs my research, we inform each other's research, and it means that we inform our clients with some geography-specific analysis, but also analysis that stretches across sectors. So we sort of managed to draw up, since our founding in 2004, many different sectors which basically tell the whole decarbonisation story from many different angles. Each of these bubbles is a team of analysts for the most part. And one of the things that we do is, a very small subset of what we do, is predict carbon prices. So this is one of the original things that BNEF did, and this is our latest forecast for the EU ETS. And you can see here that we are relatively bullish with things, expecting it to get towards surpass 190 euros per tonne mark by 2035. And that is something that you can overlay with the timeline that we've just seen here, where you basically get to 2034, and from 2035 onwards, you end up having this carbon price imposed on imported goods through the CBAM that we just heard. That means a number of things. It means it's going to be a lot harder as free allocation is removed as a result of this to keep blast furnaces running in Europe. And then it also means this has a big impact on imported goods. So how do we do this whole defining what the impact's going to be? Well, it looks pretty simple if you just take national average intensities. I mean, we've just heard about the fact that there will be sort of a registry with sort of average emissions for different regions of origin. And you can sort of start to, I mean, these numbers are often debated ad infinitum, but you can look at, there's a range for them, but you can start to take these different intensities, you can put a range on, then you choose the year that you want. And if you're after the period where free allocation is phased out, well, you multiply that carbon price by this figure and you end up having a CBAM tariff. And then you can come up with pretty simple looking charts like this, where you can compare the old delivered cost of steel from different countries of origin, the blue, with in 2034, again, at the end of this implementation period, where you can begin to see, well, what could, on the face of it, what looks like the sort of competitive map is completely redrawn, where you see the US with its low emissions intensity of production due to its heavy reliance on the AF is quite low in terms of the impact, whereas India is far more impacted. This, however, is an extremely simplified picture of things, and actually is really not entirely accurate. And that's something that I'd like to sort of mention, because I think it's a really important aspect of this policy, which is basically the fact that we're not using national averages. Where there is reporting, and as we've just heard, there will be reporting that's encouraged, well, you use facility level emissions, and that's very important. What are those emissions going to be? Well, this is a map, there's a representation of all the different steel plants in the world, and you can see that they come in all shapes and sizes, as you're all extremely well aware. And if you take somewhere, and just to explain this, I mean, this is when, on the x-axis is when those plants came online or are planned to come online. You can see the countries or regions where they're coming online on the y-axis, and then the size is basically the size of their production, and they're coloured by BOF-EAF. The conclusion being that things are pretty diverse when you look at the production pool, and you can look at places like China, for example, with on average one of the big steel producers with the youngest fleet in terms of production fleet. And you can say, okay, Chinese steel's emission average might be 1.6 to 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. It's all over the shop in terms of the estimates. But actually knowing what the average emissions of Chinese steel that's coming into Europe to comply with this policy and what tariff they're going to face is actually really difficult, because we're not sure exactly who's going to be importing. And that's a real big part of this, is the fact that, you know, China might make more than half the world's steel. It only exports a couple of percentage points of the steel that it makes. And of that, a tiny sliver goes to the EU. So it's not unthinkable that if the carbon price was set at a level at which was punitive, that you could end up having steel come into Europe with a much lower emissions intensity from China, for example, than the European average. That's one of the outcomes of doing things in an extremely fair way with this facility level calculation. So it makes my job and the job of anyone trying to predict what this policy's impact is going to be extremely hard. But it also makes things very interesting, because it throws this calculus sort of into questions. And that's something that's going to be defined in the coming months and years as we sort of get a better idea of what this policy is going to look like. That's one bit of the equation where there's question marks, extremely interesting ones. And I mean, there are various solutions. The EU isn't caught unguard. I'm not surprising Vincente with this. It's already thought of various ways it's going to address this. There's going to be a regular revision of circumvention, sort of to put in place measures for circumvention, to sort of deal with perceived risks of resource shuffling as they emerge. And this is a dynamic policy that will be responsive and address those risks. There are other proposals that have been made that are less likely to be followed, such as using company-wide emissions averages rather than country-level emissions averages. But those are just proposals by the private sector, and I don't expect they'll actually make their way into the final policy. There's other aspects of this calculus that you can also look at. You can look at this extremely interesting last bit of the equation. This is a simplified equation, but the last bit here, which is deducting the carbon price that's been paid in the region of origin. What does that mean? Well, if we assume, and this maybe is being very optimistic, that the UK, for example, has roughly a similar carbon price to the EU carbon price in 2034, then that takes a big chunk of out of its CBAM tariff. So this is where things, you know, if you have a prediction as to what carbon prices are going to be in different regions of origin, then you can actually come to a pretty reasonable estimate of what the impact here could be. I mean, the UK carbon price is far below the EU's at present. That could change. I think it was tracking it until quite recently, but it's not unthinkable that it would be high enough in 2034 to take a large section of this tariff out of the equation. And that, as we've heard, has made things pick up in terms of other regions that weren't really thinking about carbon pricing in the past, like Turkey, like India, like Brazil, talk to the European Commission and try to understand what's going on, and has really kicked off in a very promising way a lot of discussions about pricing carbon, and it's also lent given an added momentum to discussions that were already happening in China, that were already happening in Japan, for example. But things get quite interesting when you compare the EU's carbon price with global carbon pricing. So this is taxes and cap and trade schemes, compliance markets globally. The price is on the x-axis, the size is the size of the emissions that carbon price covers. And you can see that the EU is really pretty ahead of the curve. That's why it's putting in place this kind of a policy. It all makes sense. But it also means that in many parts of the world that are quite nascent in their efforts to price carbon, then the impact of their prices, and this is just taking a forecast that I saw published by an industry association in China, could be quite minimal. And that's just something to bear in mind, is that with these discussions with India, with Turkey, there needs to be an understanding that, sure, carbon prices might make an impact, but those regions are unlikely to be able to have anywhere near the same carbon price as the EU and absorb it over the next 10, 20 years. So there needs to be an understanding of the fact that there needs to be financial support for decarbonising industry in poorer countries. The European Commission understands this very well and is already extremely active in doing so. There's also some different proposals that have come out of places like the IMF about accounting for developmental status when crediting carbon pricing in countries of origin. That's a bit tricky. That's going to be very hard to factor in. Again, probably a little bit too difficult, a bridge too far for this policy, but an interesting question nonetheless. But I would just say that it's extremely important in these discussions to be very clear about the EU's role in providing development finance and actually helping the decarbonisation of heavy industry in countries of origin. And it's not just all about this carbon price and crediting, and that will be the solution to everything. There's lots of other schemes coming out. This is sort of the final point I'd like to make. Here it's kind of hard to filter out the noise from the signal. There's some extremely early stage conversations going on in places like Canada and places like Australia, where various sort of consultations have been launched. And there's progress there in terms of adopting something similar. Nowhere has got to the same stage as the UK, where that's an official government position that by 2027 there will be a UK CBAM that will be implemented. And in the US, well, that's where things get interesting. There's many different bills that are being proposed for doing all kinds of things, from just tracking emissions coming into the US to imposing something that looks like a CBAM, but is actually very different. And perhaps a little bit more you could easily phrase it as perhaps a little bit more protectionist in terms of the way in which it's framed and the way in which it would be implemented. But still, again, in the US, this is a conversation that has bipartisan support for the most part. It's been expressed in a number of bills and hasn't yet been crystallized into any sort of final policy position. So lining up methodology seems pretty important in terms of these policies. Again, the European Commission has been extremely active in doing so. Global coordination on crediting carbon pricing has been something that's been going on in every single COP. There's discussions around doing this. It's extremely hard. If anyone's been following Article 6 negotiations around voluntary markets, for example, then you'll get an idea of how tough that is. And I'll just finish with the fact that this is new and it's difficult, and accounting for carbon embodied in trade flows is a new challenge. Accounting for carbon pricing in countries of origin is a new challenge. Engaging diplomatically around this extremely sensitive topic is a new challenge, and really doing this in a way in which is seemingly aligned with WTO rules, which it seems like there's a good case to be made for this policy as being sort of within the realms of what's conceivable under international law, is also a big challenge. And it all underpins this even bigger challenge, which Europe is trying to pull off, which is decarbonising its heavy industry earlier than most without deindustrialising as a result. So I'll just say that this is extremely fascinating as a policy for people like me writing about it. It's extremely difficult for people like Vincente who have to communicate about it and put it in place, but it's extremely important for global decarbonisation. And I think the next few months where we're going to get a better idea of what this looks like, you just saw the timeline with different implementation acts and details that will be released, are also going to be extremely important. So I'll finish with that, and I look forward to what should be a really interesting discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that interesting perspective as well. I think it goes a bit broader than CBAM, and hopefully leads us to bring up some sort of topics more broadly related to this whole area. So we're going to now have a panel discussion, and I would like Axel Eggerts, Director General of the Eurofair, the European Steel Association, and Kevin Dempsey, CEO and Chairman of the American Iron and Steel Institute, to join the panel. If you can just leave me the last chair there, maybe. All right. While we start the discussion here on the stage, please do think of questions that you would like to ask our panelists. Because I'm going to make sure that there is some time for questions from the floor this time. So before we go into specific topics, I'd like to ask Axel and Kevin, what's your reactions to the presentations that you've seen, and is there something you would like to add? Do you want to go first, Axel? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks also for the invitation, and thanks for the good presentations. Almost everything was in there. Also the problems which we are facing. First of all, the European steel industry, of course, supports the CBAM, this initiative by the European Commission. But of course, this is only one measure to avoid carbon leakage. And I will explain why. Because the imports make up round about on average 5% of foreign producers' production. So that producer would only have to pay the CBAM levy on that part of his production. While in Europe, you pay this for every single ton of steel you produce. So you can imagine that this has an impact also on investors, who will think, of course, okay, what is the balance of the companies, the impact of that. So therefore, it is very important to understand that this is one measure, and that's also why we, as Eurofair, fully support the initiative taken by President Joe Biden and Ms. von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, to work on a global arrangement for steel, for sustainable steel and aluminium. So this is very important. Secondly, I believe you have mentioned some of the key topics. That is, the effectiveness of the system will have to be proven, of course. Issues such as circumvention, resource shuffling, you have mentioned that, can indeed be a big problem if companies from third countries only export to the EU from their most CO2 efficient installations. So this is a type of distortion in our view, for which we do not yet have the real solution. So we will have to work on that likely. You mentioned, Vincente, also downstream sectors. Or downstream products. So for example, a car, 1 ton of steel. How do you deal with that? Because that is a disadvantage, clearly also for the European automotive industry, and with that for us as a steel industry, because it's an additional cost that the competitor does not have. The third point here is the export solution. You also mentioned that, Vincent, very important for us. In 2018, we exported steel and steel products like tubes, rails, at a value at that time 45 billion euros. that was around about 75–80% of the total export value of the CBAM sectors. So we are about to lose that if we do not find a solution for the exports. With one point I disagree with you, Vincent. You say there is hardly any impact today by the carbon price. I believe there is an impact already on our industry because if 20 euros per ton of steel, or if you, let's say you take the price we had recently, 100 euro per ton of CO2, then this is around about 35 to 40 euros already today, additional costs. And if you then see your analysis where the carbon price goes to 140, 150 euros in 2030, then, of course, this has a huge impact already very soon if we do not find the right solutions for that. So I could say a lot of more, but I stop.
I'm sure you can speak the whole session, but we'll move to you, Kevin, and then we get some more discussion going. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and really appreciated hearing the presentations before. Obviously, for the U.S. industry, we, on the one hand, we're not that concerned about the CBAM. A very, very small percentage of American steel exports go to the EU. So in terms of, from an exporting interest, it's going to be a relatively small share. And our emissions levels are, I think, relatively low compared to many other countries. So how much of an impact would be, it's hard to say. Obviously, there are burdens, administrative burdens of the sort that you've already mentioned. There's the concerns about the exporting companies' confidential data. I think what you laid out about maybe allowing for a mechanism for exporting companies to provide some of that data directly, I think would be very, very positive. But I'd say more broadly, as a representing steel producers in the United States that are also very committed to decarbonization and recognize the significant costs involved in decarbonization. I think the underlying purpose behind the EU CBAM is one we strongly support, we strongly agree with. There is a real risk, I think, for steel industries in countries with significant climate ambition if there is not some measure at the border to ensure against carbon leakage, carbon dumping, whatever you want to call it. There's a real risk that steel could be imported from countries that do not have a similar ambition and would therefore have a competitive advantage and could undercut those companies that are either paying a carbon price as part of the ETS or committing significant funds of their own to invest in decarbonization, as many U.S. companies are doing. And that's a great risk. That's a risk for steel producers, and it's a risk for our economy as a whole and the climate, because I think that could set back the ambition towards a decarbonization that I think we all share. So I think we believe that the development of some type of carbon border fee is something that is important not only for Europe, but also for the United States. As was noted, we are in a different position. We do not have an ETS. There was a legislative attempt a number of years ago to develop something, but that went nowhere. And there's really no prospect in the foreseeable future for the U.S. to adopt its own carbon trading scheme or a direct domestic carbon price. There are proposals to do that, but I don't think in the near term we see the political support for that. But one area where there is, I think, a growing sense of common interest by people from both political parties and throughout the steel industry and a number of other industries is in developing some type of carbon fee at the border to address this carbon leakage competitiveness issue. Not having a domestic carbon price, we're not likely to adopt something that looks like the EU CBAM. Instead, the proposals, as was mentioned, that there are a number of legislative proposals that are really built around accounting for the differential in carbon intensity between domestic production of particular products and imports. that might require you to effectively establish an implicit carbon price at the border when you were calculating that. But those types of details are yet to be worked out. We are, I think, at a much earlier stage in developing our own ideas on that. But I do think it's something that, regardless of how the election is in November come out, I think this will remain a big topic in the United States. Both President Biden has been noted, the White House recently established a climate and trade task force that is specifically looking at the questions of how to establish a carbon border fee in terms of what data would need to be collected, how would you calculate it, how would it be applied. But the top advisors on trade to former President Trump have expressed similar interest in a carbon border fee. So I think, and there's bipartisan support, certainly in the United States Senate. It's less developed in the House. But I see that as a process that will be under continued development. It will take a number of time. There are a lot of difficult questions, and I think I do appreciate some of the detail presented by Vicente, because I think we're going to face a lot of the same type of questions. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the EU as you go through that process. I will say that I also agree with Axel that we continue to hope that we can find a way for the US and the EU to work together through this proposed global arrangement on sustainable steel, where not to harmonize our systems, because I think they're going to be different systems, but at least to recognize some commonality of approach and maybe look for areas where we can work together. One area that's been mentioned in previous panels, and I remember was discussed in previous sessions of the Open Forum, is on developing common methodology. How do we calculate properly the carbon emissions intensity for steel products? I would note that in the U.S., we have a process underway right now through our U.S. International Trade Commission that is collecting data on the domestic steel and aluminum industries and is working to develop a database that would come out early next year. And we'll have to see what sort of problems they run into. One thing I do note is that the scope proposed for that process is much broader. It's not just scope 1. It includes scope 2 and scope 3, which I do think are important to account for, although they add additional complexity. There is no doubt. So I'll just stop there and say I think it's a very interesting subject. I think there's a lot for us to cooperate on, a lot for us to learn from the EU experiment, and it's one in which we wish you great success.
All right, thanks for those comments. I have a few sort of topics that I'd like to raise with the panel first, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor. And the first one is, following the developments of CBAM and implementation sort of in media reporting, I at least got the impression that in the beginning, when it was first announced, there were lots of upset voices from countries around the world claiming that this was a protectionist measure and that they would be challenging in the WTO and so on. And it seems that as we've moved closer to the implementation and actually started this transition phase, that those discussions are not, at least what I experienced, not as lively or as vocal anymore, and that we rather see that countries are more considering similar measures, like we've heard you refer to, or indeed emissions sort of costing schemes and so on. First of all, do you share this view, and how has the discussion been going with third countries? Maybe I'll start with you, Vicente. Maybe Antoine, later you would like to comment as well. You just speak.
To speak?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for the question. So. No, that's true. I mean, your perception.
Is it okay? No? Try again. You're not supposed to have to.
Does it work? No. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, I have to learn with the technology. Thank you. No, I mean, your perception is right. I mean, when we first announced this measure back in, well, I remember it was in 2019 when it was announced as a carbon border tax by President von der Leyen. That was part of her political guidelines. And then we started working on this. We realized that it had to be something that mirrors the EU ETS, because this is the carbon price that we have in place. And then we started, of course, elaborating, discussing, and announcing the adoption of this CBAM. The first reaction, of course, was to say this is a trade measure, this is protectionist, you are trying to protect the competitiveness of the EU industry, and you are putting a price on us, and you are telling us how, or you are patronizing how we have to manufacture in our countries. But then the conversations started to go on, and you can see that most of the countries understood that the design of the measure is not incompatible with the WTO. The way we are doing is sort of fairness with the EU producers, and they understand the system. It doesn't mean that you like it, of course. Nobody likes that you have an additional cost when you're exporting to the EU. But I think that what basically are trying to do is to understand how it works and how to get prepared. And there are different strategies. Those countries where already the governments or the Ministry of Environment are taking CBAM as an opportunity, for example, to introduce or to reinforce their carbon pricing, and also their monitoring systems. They want to understand our methodology. They want to take this opportunity really to put in place their own system. We get a lot of questions about the revenues. I mean, we don't do this to collect the revenues, even if it's true that we have announced that this will be a new own resource of the EU budget, but I can tell you that the numbers are not so dramatic. I mean, and of course the EU at the same time is one of the main donors at international level in terms of supporting green transition. So they understand also that by introducing their carbon price, first, they introduce monitoring, so they know how to prepare for compliance with CBAM, and at the same time, which is even more important, they get their revenues. Because then, as we said before, they can be discounted, of course, from the CBAM adjustment. And that's something that we really appreciate. Again, we don't do that to collect the revenues, but to reduce emissions. And I would like to come to one of the points that raised Axel, which I think is very relevant. And I think you also mentioned, Antoine, about circumvention, resource shuffling. Precisely by introducing carbon pricing in these countries, you solve the problem that you were saying before. I mean, the problem, of course, is if they don't introduce carbon pricing, they concentrate green goods for the EU market, and then there can be some sort of reshuffling. I mean, that's something, of course, that we want to analyze. But if these countries also introduce carbon pricing, that, of course, will apply across the board to all the producers, whether they produce for the EU market or they produce for their own market. And that's really one of the objectives. So they want to understand, for example, how to introduce carbon pricing, how to monitor, and also they want to understand how we can support or help them with financial support in order to introduce projects to, for example, greening their electricity production. That's the good side, or the good picture. I will not be naive, and I will be completely transparent. Of course, there are basically two countries which are more active still against the CBAM. We are doing a long campaign with them, a reinforced campaign with them to explain so that we can help them also to understand and to get prepared to apply CBAM. We have to see. I mean, we've been to the WTO, to Geneva several times. My Director General, Mr. Thomas, has been there discussing with Ngozi, Professor Ngozi, several times about CBAM. And you can see also that the perception is moving. And now the interest also goes more from discussing WTO compliance into reducing the administrative burden. And I think that's something, of course, that not only for the importers, but also for the producers now we are taking seriously. And that's also one part of our work.
I'll jump in on that, and I'll just say that I think we went through a few phases when this was initially announced, and there were a lot of sort of knee-jerk reactions, which is kind of normal because that's what happens with international trade. But you sort of had the BRICS countries issue a statement against this policy. You had China be very vocal. You had even the Australian Minister of Trade at one point said they were going to be extremely forceful in pushing back against the CBAM. But then I think what happened was there was a period of sort of understanding, of connecting with the European Commission, but also just running the numbers and seeing that when you actually look at the share of production that really goes to the EU, the impact economically on all but a number of really minor edge cases is extremely minimal. So I think that was a bit of a stock check where people actually ran and looked at the data and realized that this is a policy that's being phased in quite slowly and in quite a limited way. And I think that's been something that's been increasingly appreciated, and that's why the engagement recently has maybe been a bit more constructive than the initial optics, which weren't great. I'll just say that it is surprising how much pushback and opposition the European Commission has faced for the great pains that have been taken to craft something in a very careful way, which is quite fair and really which is seemingly pretty aligned with a lot of the principles embodied by things like the founding charter of the WTO, the GATT. Despite that, there's been a massive amount of pushback and branding this as sort of unilateral, rich world green protectionism, etc., etc., etc. Meanwhile, sort of tariffs are raised in all kinds of directions all over the world for others, and no one really bats an eyelid. So I think that this has been a real challenge. We're entering a new, more constructive phase of this policy being put in place, and now the challenge, as has just been said, is about actually talking to governments like Brazil, which have come out said very recently with the new Lula administration, okay, now we want to engage, we want to put in place carbon pricing, we want to green our economy and our heavy industry, but are completely vague as to what any of that looks like. So the next steps are to really sort of connect the dots and to provide the kind of technical assistance, financial assistance, and sort of have this sustained outreach with those different countries to ensure that the rollout continues to be smooth.
All right, so let's just say that CBAM is implemented, let's say, smoothly, everything is going well, the CBAM, so how can I say, yeah, the CBAM is being paid, these countries are introducing their own carbon systems, you have that in many more countries than you do today. Is there a likelihood that we'll reach, well, one, the let's say, utopia of a unified global carbon price? How likely is that? But on the way to that, could we reach a point where carbon becomes a cost like any other cost? So you have your energy costs, you have your labor costs, and then you have your carbon costs as being, it's not necessarily the same everywhere, but it's being a factor of production like any other one. Do you think we'll reach that point at some point, and is it desirable? Axel, you look like you want to jump in.
Yes, thank you. It's absolutely desirable, but the likelihood that this will happen in the next 30 years is...
Are you talking about the uniform
very,
now?
very slim. First of all, of course, the Commission had tried to have a global emissions trading system, or any other global system. This would be ideal, of course, but that obviously will not happen. Carbon costs are regulatory costs, and if you have different systems, you have different levels of carbon costs. That means there is always a kind of carbon leakage or unlevel playing field. What you can try is, of course, to minimize these differences, the carbon leakage, as much as possible. But as long as you do not have a unified system, which is very unlikely, you will be stuck with some problems.
Yeah, I'll give you just my perspective. I don't see us having a global carbon cost anytime soon. Certainly, I don't think that's going to happen in the U.S. I do think carbon emissions and companies reporting on their carbon emissions is going to become very, very common as part of issuing environmental product declarations and things of that sort, because the market will demand it. So there will be a lot of data available. That's where I think it becomes a real challenge if we have a lot of different systems for how we calculate it. So perhaps not trying to get to a global carbon price, but just a global approach to what we are measuring and how to report it for steel products, so that there can be some comparisons between countries that are on the same basis. I think that would be a big advantage, but I don't see that being necessarily tied to a cost. They're going to be. Countries are going to continue to have very different regulatory systems, just like countries have very different political systems, and that's just a fact that I think we're going to continue to face. We'll need to try to have systems to negotiate between differences between countries to the best you can, but I don't think we should be trying to get to harmonization. You know, in the U.S., you know, we continue to believe that the approach of imposing a price on carbon domestically is not the best way to achieve decarbonization. We have found and continue to believe that the incentive-based approach to the Inflation Reduction Act is producing real benefits, and that's encouraging increased investments that are driving down emissions, but allowing the private sector to determine the best way to devote those funds rather than having them collected by governments. So I think there are going to be still some fundamental differences of what's the best approach, but I think we should, again, focus on where we have commonality of the same goals of decarbonization and look for ways where we can encourage greater transparency of information on a common basis that allow the market to help determine the best way to move forward.
I completely agree that it would be great to have the same carbon price around the globe. I suppose that's only for the dreamers. It's going to be difficult. Also because the starting point is different, and when you listen to the other countries, African countries or Asian countries, they will always say, we didn't contribute to the number of emissions, so the contribution should also be different. This is also why, for example, the WTO or the IMF, they have proposed a carbon price floor, which would apply to all countries around the world, but which would, of course, take into account some criteria like the GDP per capita, like the historical contribution to emissions, and that would produce different carbon prices. So in the end, there would not be a common carbon price. Could be a good start in the sense that everyone introduces carbon pricing, but it would be a different carbon price. And then there is, of course, the question of how to share the revenues. But that's something that, of course, I'm sure they will be discussing COP29 very, very, deeply. However, if we can be a dreamer, look at the example of, I don't know how much you know about taxation and the OECD Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, this minimum taxation level of taxation of 15% for the multinationals. There has been an agreement, it's been implemented. Of course, there are some still bottlenecks, but there will be, of course, an implementation because countries have committed to that. We could consider maybe in the future that not a carbon price that applies in all countries to all producers, but maybe if we concentrate on the large emitters around the world, why not? That's something that could be feasible. So we could consider like a new Pillar 3, which would be some sort of carbon tax on all the large emitters around the world. Of course, we will need to see how this interferes or that would work with the EU ETS. That's another thing, but you can leave it to us because we are paid for this type of things. I'm not going to comment in whether IRA is the best approach, the best way. I personally think that there always have to be different approaches, and that you can also tackle the same problem with several approaches at the same time. So I think that subsidizing the good practices is a good idea, but also at the same time, I think that the carrot and the stick is something that can work. So sometimes it's good to have a common approach by which you really not subsidize, but you give an incentive, a positive incentive to those or who are introducing new technologies, and at the same time, of course, you put a price on the emissions. But we have the same in the EU. There is an innovation fund, there is a modernization fund within the EU ETS, which supports, of course, the decarbonization and the efforts of those companies who are investing, for example, in particular, in CCU and in CCS.
Just very quickly. I think there might be more progress on carbon pricing in certain sectors like shipping, but there's been so much difficulty in figuring out a joint approach for even trading and recognizing the voluntary market for carbon offsets that I think accounting for any kind of real progress when it comes to compliance markets is a bit of a pipe dream, and it's very unlikely to really happen in any kind of sense. So I'm just repeating what's been said. And then if carbon price will become part of the cost of steel, just generally, I think yes, but probably in quite a limited number of areas in the world where you actually start to see what's happening in the EU, where at present, yes, there's a price. No one's really paying much of it because of free allocation. When that strips off, of course, that will become part of the production cost. But how many parts of the world are really going to impose high levels of actual effective carbon pricing in heavy industry? When the US is raising question marks about the validity of that approach from this kind of basic starting point, then I think that's a bit of another question mark as well.
I'm gonna I'm not gonna allow any more comments from the panel at this stage. I'd like to hear from the audience. So we have a question immediately there. Yeah, just introduce yourself, and then if you have a question for someone specific, just allocate. Yeah.
Thank you for an engaging discussion. Gabriel Rosenberg, my company is called CBAM. We're building compliance tools for CBAMs around the world. My question is about the definitive period and where default values might land, and what the panel think about where they should be. Vicente may not be able to answer it very directly. Whether there's any particular reason why default values should not be set at a kind of maximally punitive level, consistent with the highest polluting emitters, because anything lower than that would allow those emitters off the hook. And in that context, you might also want to talk about the fact that the UK is proposing having a default value set at a global average level, which is not at all punitive. Thank you.
You are right. I mean, the default values should not be the best way to... Sorry. No, yeah, in the definitive period, you will be able to provide your real emissions, and that's the idea, because the system is based on a system by which we want to reward those who are polluting less, so that we give a real incentive to decarbonize. If you are only based on default values, then you don't give this possibility. But then, of course, we need to come with some default values, because there will be cases where it's impossible to monitor, or even if they monitor, we cannot rely on the monitoring, or there is no verification, or the verification is not reliable. So this is why we will come with those default values. We are still working on those default values. They could possibly be based on the average of the carbon intensity in those countries, but we are also thinking about some sort of markup. I referred to the markup before. I cannot say now how the markup will work, but the idea is, of course, that we need to take into account that the average maybe in one country or in some countries may be too low in comparison with those who are really exporting to the EU. But at the same time, of course, we cannot really concentrate and target those who are exporting to the EU in isolation for the default values. We don't have that data. So we need to come up with a system which is fair, but at the same time simple, by which we will set the default values, possibly looking at the average in that country, but then with the markup that will take into account the possibilities of deviating from that average in that country. But again, those values should be really a disincentive to use default values, and an incentive, of course, to go for the real emissions, because this is really what we want and expect to do. So we think that maybe for very small producers, very small importations at the beginning, for example, you are importing less than 1 ton of CO2 embedded emissions, then of course it doesn't make sense that you have to monitor, you have to report, you have to verify your emissions. But of course, when you come to the situation where the emissions will be higher, of course there will be an incentive to go for the actual emissions.
Did you want to? Yeah, okay.
Yes, thanks. Your analysis is absolutely correct. That is our position as Eurofair. We need the default value at the highest emitting installation globally. Otherwise, you play into the hands of the high emitters. So that is very important. And secondly, exempting small importers, I'm not so sure whether it's necessary, because steel producers, they are all bigger companies. They're all big companies. If they can introduce directly upload the data in the registry, you don't need any more the importer for that. But I believe you're working on this as well.
All right, let's see. Are there any more questions in the room? All right, let's start. Yeah. Okay, let's start. Sorry, it was you from Steelwatch, right? And then John, you go after. Yeah.
It's a comment, really. The idea of a carbon price is to capture externalities, so that business has to take into account the impacts on society. And I commend the EU for moving forward quite ambitiously. I hope it sticks. We're beginning to see the impacts of climate change, and some recent research has been done on the real impacts of climate change, which has transformed the estimates that were done 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. So the societal carbon cost of carbon, was estimated around $185 per tonne. And so the carbon prices that we're talking about in these scenarios sort of make sense depending on whether a country takes the global cost into account or only their own share, which is a share of them. The latest research looking at the impacts on GDP and impacts on welfare actually estimate that the true societal cost of carbon is going to be $1,056 per tonne of carbon. This paper came out a few months ago. And it argues that even if the US only takes its own share, the impact on the US, not the globe, it's over $200 per tonne of carbon. Now, I'm just wondering kind of what is going to happen to the dynamics of these conversations if this paper is remotely right. You know, do you think the different regions of the world will stick where they are? Or are we actually heading to something very different, and the countries that have perhaps already started with carbon prices will find it easier, or will we have so much backlash because of that we will polarize more? I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment. When we really have a cost, society bearing a cost of each tonne of carbon that is over $1,000 due to the damage created, particularly by the weather events, that's what they're arguing. What will happen to this?
All right, who'd like to take a shot at that one?
Well,
Yeah.
she mentioned the U.S., so I'll just start. Obviously, we don't have a carbon price, although we do. The U.S. government does, as you probably know, calculate a social cost of carbon for regulatory analysis purposes. So there is a process for looking at that. You know, there's no doubt there's a real cost to climate change, and that we must, I think it's important to emphasize the whole purpose of this gathering, that the steel industry believes that addressing climate is critical, and we are, as an industry, very much committed to decarbonization. The challenge is, from my standpoint, what's the most effective way to get to the decarbonization we all desire? I think setting a very high punitive price on carbon, frankly, runs the risk of diverting resources away from the most effective use to actually decarbonize. We know that there's going to require a lot of money, investments in new technology. One of the advantages that the steel industry has today, because of the good work that's been done in recent years, is I think we have a really good idea on what some of the key technologies are that we need to develop. We talked about that earlier today in terms of hydrogen, clean hydrogen. I think there'll be a role for carbon capture, certainly continued push for clean energy. So that would be my main concern, is to set too high a price that's collected in some form of a tax, and you divert revenue from what could be a more effective use to actually achieve near-term decarbonization.
I'd just say that I think it's a really good question. I also think that it's no one is saying it's just going to be achieved by a carbon price, even in the EU. You got things like even for heavy industry, so contracts for difference, carbon contracts for difference being launched by Germany. We've just had the results of the European hydrogen auction. There's all kinds of different subsidy schemes for renewables, and that's not even talking about all these grants for electric vehicles or home renovation. There's a real stack, and carbon pricing comes on top of that. But that's not to say that we're going anywhere near enough for, I think most people have given up on 1.5 degrees globally. 2 looks pretty ambitious right now. So obviously a lot more needs to be done. But I think carbon pricing is one part of the toolbox, and even in the parts of the world where it's a big part of that toolbox, i.e. the EU, I don't think that's really being seen as the sole measure. But pretty crazy results coming out of those different papers, and they really are worth following and paying attention to.
All right. John, you had a question?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the question of leakage, deindustrialization. Take the liberty of putting myself in actual shoes for the moment, at least what I think are her shoes. The EU has been deindustrializing for some period of time. And if by that, I look at the World Steel Association measurement of indirect trade and for indirect steel trade, and for years, the EU was a net indirect steel exporter, right? They exported more steel-containing goods than they imported. Now that's reversed based on the 2019 data, and other data suggest that the EU is already on a trajectory of importing more and more manufactured goods than export. So when it comes to leakage, there's kind of first order leakage and second order leakage. First order leakage is the direct steel trade, but the second order leakage is this what you call downstream or manufacturing. And look, in the case of automotive, it's pretty clear. It is the amounts and type of steel that go into a car is completely known. Right, and the USMCA and the automotive agreement there has very explicit ways of calculating melt of country of origin and such. So I could readily imagine for automotive it being relatively easy to assign the carbon value associated with a vehicle import. But once you get outside of automotive and maybe appliance, the myriad of ways in which steel is used and manufactured, to me makes it, incredibly complex, right? If not impossible, to be able to to manage that second order leakage. And the concern I would have is, all the complexity involved in just implementing the scheme as it exists now. It doesn't, once manufacturing goes offshore, it's really hard to bring it back. And the concern I would have is that unless this downstream leakage is addressed pretty quickly, that there will be market erosion, which is going to be difficult to claw back. So, interesting reaction to that.
I mean, the question of the downstream goods, of course, is something which is important and has been raised to our attention. When I said before that when we did the analysis in 2021 and we came to the conclusion that there was not such a meaningful impact, is because we were looking at the price of the ETS at the moment, of course, and we were also looking at the level of the free allowances, how they were going away. Taking into account all this, and then, of course, if you look at the part, because what you need to compare is the impact of the cost of the CBAM in the imported steel with the final price of the product. So at that moment, our estimation was really meaningless. I mean, there is a report that I got recently from Aplia. They are the producers of washing machines, fridges, and all these type of products. And for example, they estimated that by 2030, the impact could be around €7 in the final price of the product. Whether this is a meaningful impact or not, we can discuss. But of course, everything will depend in the future of many variables that we cannot control at this moment. You mentioned how the carbon price is going to be evolving, or the price of the ETS. Of course, if it increases a lot, the impact will be more important. And also it depends on the carbon intensity and where we buy the steel, where we can produce the cars, etc. But that's something we are analyzing. Now we are going to launch a study. We are in the phase of identifying now the consultant, where we precisely want to analyze this. There was an obligation in the CBAM regulation introduced by the Parliament and the Council to analyze the impact on downstream goods before the end of this year. We are a bit behind the schedule, I'm afraid. There's a lot of pressure, but in any case, of course, before the end of the transitional period, we will be analyzing that, and then on the basis of that report, we will then decide whether it makes sense to extend to some downstream goods. As you said, there are thousands of downstream goods. We will have to concentrate on those where there is, of course, more intensity in the use of steel, aluminum in particular. I don't think it's the case for cement, because you don't move the buildings from one country to another, not yet. That will come, of course. But I think that's something, of course, that we want to analyze, and we will be reporting about that. But we are aware of that, and
I would say speed is of the essence. Again, because once downstream manufacturers make decisions, it's difficult for them to reverse. And in a world of uncertainty, right, they may make the wrong choices, at least from the standpoint of the industry.
No, I fully agree with you. The difficulty is, the easiest part is what I said before. We can calculate the impact of the CBAM in the final price of the downstream good. But what is more difficult is, of course, the competitiveness of the production of that industry in the EU, because it may depend on many other factors, as you know. could be the labor cost, it could be the access to the materials. I mean, there might be many other reasons that justify that the production may delocalize. But of course, that will be part of the analysis. And what we don't want, of course, is that by introducing CBAM, we were helping to the decentralized industrialization of Europe. And I can imagine, I mean, I'm anticipating that, of course, one of the main points or issues, topics in the next Commission will be again the question of the competitiveness of the EU industry and the reindustrialization of the EU.
Yeah, John, this of course has also to do with issues, you have mentioned some, but also and in particular it's non-market access capacity, which is creating a big problem for steel manufacturers in Europe and in the US and in some other regions. So as long as the EU and the US cannot tackle this issue of subsidizing capacity with no view on climate protection anyway, we have a problem and we have to tackle that, and I think the CBAM cannot do that, and that's the reason why there was this agreement between the EU and the US to work on that. One last word on the lady, Steelwatch I think, or I don't know. We should not differentiate for the big industry between countries, developing, least developed. If you're talking about steel industry, it's global. It's a global industry. It has nothing to do whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Italy, or whether it's in Mozambique. It has nothing to do with that. So we should make no exemptions. And one of the big problems is that some countries allow their big industry to become carbon neutral or decarbonize only after 2050. That's a problem. OECD numbers for the next 3 years, 155 million tons additional steel capacity on the way. Most of that is conventional, very CO2 intensive steel technology. They're locking in emissions. And only these next 3 years will wipe out entirely all the EU steel makers' decarbonization, carbon neutrality efforts by 2050, only in 3 years. We need to react on that. And it's yet not happening, unfortunately. Thanks. And then the carbon price doesn't make so much a difference. If we can pass it on, yeah, then it's okay.
I think that was quite a controversial statement there, but unfortunately we don't have time to dive into those details. That would have to be a conversation over coffee and dinner. Well, in the end, we've run out of time. Thanks everyone for your excellent questions. Thanks to the panelists and to the presenters for your views and your comments. We are going to close the first day now. Just a reminder for those of you going to dinner, I know I've been talking about this all the time, but we are leaving, we're meeting rather in the lobby at 5:45, which means in 45 minutes, so you have time to just freshen up, don't lay down, and join us in the lobby to go by bus to the venue for the dinner. And then we're meeting here, back in the same room, a similar setup for tomorrow. Then we start at 9 o'clock in the morning. So thanks to everyone, including the audience.